The first speaker tonight is Bryce Gaton. Bryce is passionate about all things EV. He has more than 15 years of experience with EVs and currently writes for The Driven, as well as running the EV transition support consultancy EV Choice. He provides policy advice to governments, prepares EV transition planning reports, and does public lectures. He is a member of the Standards Australia Subcommittee, developing for domestic and commercial EV charging needs and solutions. So please welcome to the stage Bryce Gaton.
I'll start off with a brief sort of introduction on what is an EV and explain why there's only particular EVs that we worry about in the 2030 home. First up, the plug-in electric vehicle, PEV, and it's effectively two of those. They have a plug. The simplest is your battery electric vehicle, BEV, and it's basically a battery used to drive a motor, and as you slow down, that motor is turned into a generator and puts electricity back into the battery. In your plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, in the days when batteries were really expensive, to get the extra range you needed to do more than just beetling around town, you had an internal combustion engine. But as the battery prices have come down from around $1,200 US per kilowatt hour down to nearly just above $100 per kilowatt hour now US, the use case for the plug-in hybrid is actually diminishing quite quickly, because you could buy a battery electric vehicle now with 400 to 600 kilometres range, between 40 and 50,000 for the cheapest one. Some are under 40. Next one along, we're used to the hybrid electric vehicle. That's your Priuses and your Camrys, that type of vehicle. And they were the early ones. They use that same regenerative braking to, as you slow down, put power back into the battery. And that's how they save between 5% and 20% of fuel. That's why taxi drivers love them, because they were not a particularly expensive technology, but it saved them up to 20% of fuel around town. And then there's the fuel cell electric vehicle, otherwise known as the hydrogen car. And they basically use hydrogen and chemical reaction to create electricity and drive it like an electric vehicle, where you've got the combined fuel cell and electric systems. They're the two that I'll be talking about, the plug-in electric vehicles, and they're the ones that our 2030 home will be needing to charge and get power from. And in particular, the battery electric vehicle be taking over pretty much. So overseas, where the bans on the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles are coming about, Norway is 2025. They are not included in that going forward after 2025. So only plug-in hybrids and the full batteries will still be around. After that, the hybrid is counted as a petrol car, and they won't be allowed to be sold anyway. So overseas, they'll begin to stop building them. Also around that time, the fuel cell electric vehicle will disappear. It's pretty much a dead man walking a zombie at the moment, and they're pretty much disappearing. Certainly in terms of passenger vehicles, they're dead already. In terms of trucks, some of the biggest truck manufacturers are already giving up even developing there, because the battery electric vehicles are actually starting to take over even there. And also by 2030, the plug-in hybrid electric vehicles start fading. In that Norway situation, 93% of new car sales now are plug-in electric vehicles, and what used to be a half-half between plug-in hybrids and BEVs is now disappearing to 86 of that 93 is full battery, and only 87 I should say, and only 6 of those are plug-in hybrids, because that use case for the plug-in hybrid is disappearing. So we're going to talk about battery electric vehicles tonight, and those other ones are fading away. Key point with EVs is the refueling paradigm is different, and that's the one thing. We don't have to go out of our way and pull out off the road, stop at a petrol station. It's more like a mobile phone. We plug it in when we get home or at work or whatever and get it to recharge then. It's not stand around and be the fuel pump attendant. Even on the highway, if you're going Melbourne to Sydney, which I've done a lot in mine, you pull up, plug in, and then go off and do your thing. Go to the toilet, have a cup of coffee. You don't have to wait to refuel, go pay, and then move the car. It's just the moment you plugged it in, you go away and do your thing. So it saves you 5 minutes in some ways. 70 to 90% of charging is done where you live, and less than 5% is your DC fast charge, basically a replacement for a petrol station. So the key point is, if 90% or more of petrol station visits are disappearing, 90% of petrol stations better start getting nervous. EVSE, electric vehicle supply equipment, the car charger. We come with 3 basic sorts. Portables, they plug in. You have a couple of sorts there. A lot of cars come with one. That's your top left there, and the bottom one is one I use when I go off the beaten DC fast charge track, and that will do variable rates, and I can plug into even a 3-phase 32 amp power point. Then there's your home type ones, and these are the sort of things you'll be putting in at home. In a 2030 house, they'll be almost ubiquitous. You can have a hardwired one with a socket on it. Councils love those because they don't have to look after the lead, like petrol stations with a hose you use for refilling the tyres, and they get treated really badly. The councils prefer you to bring your own lead. That's what I call a BYO lead. Then you've got the tethered lead ones, which is that middle one there, and that's I always recommend for home because you just unplug the car, wrap it around the charger, and go away. And the other side of the coin is these are the big DC fast charge things, and they will do up to 150 times what a PowerPoint will give you. PowerPoint, you can recharge roughly 12 kilometres charged an hour. If you're only doing 50, 100 Ks in a week, or even 30, 40 Ks in a day, that'll be recharged in 3, 4, 5 hours overnight. So you don't have to worry about it. You just plug it in, go to sleep. I always say recharging takes me 20 seconds at home. It's just 10 seconds to plug it in when I get home, another 10 seconds in the morning to unplug it. I often get asked about other different EV plugs. What's happening now? That's the Australian system, the Type 2 plug with the DC chargers. They use 2 big pins at the bottom. That's the Type 2 CCS, combined charging system. So there's 2 cars left with the old DC plug system, and that's the Nissan Leaf and the Lexus 300e, and both of those are outgoing models. The new Lexus and the new Toyotas and the Subarus and the new Leaf, Nissan Ariya coming soon, all have the CCS2. So Australia will be CCS2, apart from a few Japanese car imports which have those pair on the left. And in America, because they have a peculiar electricity system, they've actually adopted the Tesla standard now. So they're pretty much the 3 standards in the world that you'll find. So in Australia, we have pretty much one standard. So that plug war that was talked about 5, 6 years ago is well and truly over. Coming trend, vehicle to home. So getting power out of the battery. So you're not just putting power into the car, you're getting power back out of the car again. So V2X, there's 3 layers to that. There's your vehicle to load, and you'll see there that's the CCS system where you plug your adapter into the AC port in the car, and you just plug a 3-pin lead into it, a couple of $100. CHAdeMO system, that old round one that the Japanese use, the power comes out of the DC socket, so you have to buy a $10,000 box to convert even to 240 volts AC. So that guy's using a 240 volt jackhammer, but he's got this big box, which is not terribly useful compared to the CCS system learnt, because it's a new kid on the block, and it actually decided, well, if you've got an AC to DC converter in the car, why not use it? That's why they've got this nice little adapter that just plugs in and it puts power out, very simple. For that system, it's about 15 amps out of the car in the CCS one, the one at the top. At the bottom, you can get higher power, and that's where it comes in on the vehicle to home to building, which gives power to the house, but not out to the grid. So it'll turn off for a moment and then turn on, providing power to the house, and it comes out of the DC part of both of those systems. So there will be a box on the wall converting the DC from the battery into AC for the house. In the home system, it turns off momentarily and turns back on, so you have to reset your clocks and things, but otherwise very good for a backup. If the power does fail for some hours, you can run the house. Then next one along is vehicle to grid, where it will actually match the waveforms and it'll do a seamless changeover, or you can put power out into the grid, like your solar PV systems or some battery systems do now. And that's coming. Currently, as I said, the CHAdeMO will do it. So a lot of people buy a Nissan Leaf and go, I want to do my vehicle to home or vehicle to grid. You can't. There's only 2 places in Australia, South Australia and the ACT, that have been trialling it, but you can't buy the boxes anymore that'll do it. Wallbox, who made them, don't even make that original wall box anymore. They only make it for the CCS system. But that will be coming very soon. A lot of cars now come with vehicle to load, so you can run your campsite or run some leads around the house. The next stage up being some of those CCS cars will have vehicle to home grid function built into the car, and by late this year, the battery standard is changing, so you'll actually start being able to do vehicle to home. And by early next year, when they agree to standards for talking to the grid, which David may talk a little bit more about, you'll be able to do vehicle to grid as well. So very close. So people have been asking me for years, and I keep saying, 2025, ask me again then. Now it's nearly 2025. You can talk to me more about it. And as I said, it's starting to arrive late next year, and it's the grid communications is the hold up. They've just got to agree how to do it. This is when should you charge an EV? When will your 2030 home actually be a good time to charge it, and when will be a bad time to charge it? What you're looking at here is what's called the duck curve, and this was in California back in 2012. It was a fairly even. It sort of went up a little bit during the day, spiked a little bit when people went home, and then it tailed off again. So As the years went by and more solar energy was coming in, you end up with this sort of fatter and fatter belly where there's more power being provided from the solar panels and less needed from the generators. So we end up with what's called the duck curve, because it looks like a duck, a tail, the fat belly, the head and his neck. EVs, even without being able to put power back, are really useful for the belly because they can soak up all that extra solar. So if you can go charging during the day, if you've got solar panels on your home, which will happen in 2030, there'll be more and more solar panels, more efficient systems. Plug your car in during the day. That's the best time to do it. Balancing the charging and EV and the grid. This is part of what we teach with the electricians. There's sort of three ways of looking at it. Currently, you have your dumb charger or just a power point. You just plug it in and the car will just charge at whatever the highest rate that charge is set for. And that's all it does. You need to be in control of it yourself. The customer is in control. As a customer, I can turn it on and off cheapest rates or highest rates when I need it if I have to recharge. That's the dumb system. But we're moving into the smart-ish charger realm where you can get chargers that have lots of functions that will work behind the meter. So you can set the tariff rates, you can set the timings, you can set the level of charging. You can also set these things up that if you have a house that's got a limited power supply, it'll actually measure how much power is coming into the house and take your charging up and down a little bit just to manage. If you're drawing on your all-electric house and you turn on the induction cooktop, it'll ramp the charging down while that's on so you don't pop the fuse on the house. And then you've got the smart chargers, that grid communications, and that's what's coming next year. Future-proofing, smart chargers may even be mandated at that smart grid talking to it. Vehicle to X is coming very soon. We're moving to all-electric homes, so the houses have to be capable of all of these things happening at once. So plan ahead when you're doing electrical work. If you're upgrading, put in a bigger switchboard now so you've got more slots. For EVSE, put the cabling in for a 32 amp supply, even if you're just putting a power point in. You can easily do that. You just put the circuit breaker on the suit. Dave will talk a bit more about OC, Open Charge Point Protocol. If you put one with a 1.6, they're almost 2 now. That will be a smart charger, able charger later on. The off-street parking, there are options available. That's curb charge being trialled in Port Phillip now. Apartments, basically, it's a load sharing system. It's a communication system with the chargers talking to each other. The course that I was teaching all day today, this is an accredited course for electricians, and they learn how to design the installation to suit you. When you're looking to upgrade your house and reach that 2030 point, get an electrician that knows about this course, and they'll know how to design it and set it up as you need. 10 amp, 15 amp outlet, probably no issues. If you've got an old switchboard, you probably need a new one. Single phase house, 32 amps, gas supply, pretty much any EV charger will do. If you've got an older, smaller supply, gas, you swap the main switch or circuit breaker, so if you do overload things, it'll just turn the house off. You very rarely do it, but at least you won't pop the house. 80 amp, probably mostly okay. There's those chargers that'll load sense, so they'll ramp the charges up and down. 40 amp supplies and an all-electric house can be done, but you just need to be a bit more tricky about it. So most of the time, you do not need to upgrade. If an electrician says you need a whole upgrade and bigger supply, find another electrician that's done this course. If you're looking for fact sheets and information on EVs, the AEVA, that's a QR code for it. There's a listing of all the EVs on the market in Australia at the moment and the basic features. Each one that's on the market at the moment will have a 2-page fact sheet with all the same headings, so you can compare cars easily. And when they become second-hand, they move into a second-hand template. And there's actually just created a summary page for all of the second-hand vehicles. Australian websites, I write for The Driven, thedriven.io, Electric Vehicle Council, the Electric Vehicle Industry's website, and there's lots of really good information there for the EV choice, where I have the articles from Renew that I will put up there.
Thanks, Bryce. There's going to be a exam at the end of tonight. What does CHAdeMO stand for? How many minutes on a 32 amp charge? Our next speaker, David Coote, is going to be talking more about the home, and Liz Irvin will be talking more about the neighbourhoods. David runs Analytical Engines, a smart grid and energy efficiency consultancy and software developer. Recent larger projects that they've done include pre-feasibility studies for totally renewable Phillip Island. There's some people got places down at Phillip Island, so have a chat to David about that project. And outage islanding project in Locksport down in Gippsland, and a proposed 5 megawatt solar farm on Aboriginal land down in Gippsland. David has helped many people with analysis, design and installation of distributed energy resource systems for homes, offices, farms and factories. Welcome to the stage, David.
I'm going to take you through some of the stuff you can do with your homes to get them 2030 ready. Rooftop solar, home energy management systems, displays, time of use tariffs, and EV chargers and so on. Just on that topic, who's got solar? You know, like, oh, that's excellent. Because Burundara's got a really low uptake. How many people have got a battery or are thinking about getting a battery? Wow, much higher than the average. Who's actually done the transition from gas to electricity? Wow, that's a very inspiring selection of people. That's terrific. So here's some headwinds that I think that people are going to be facing for their energy systems and their energy costs and so on over the next 5 years. Well, the climate change, you know, that's why a lot of us are here tonight. You know, climate change. I mean, the things are going to get more difficult. The complications of moving the grid to solar and wind, to variable renewable energy and electrifying transport. I was in a standards meeting earlier today with a whole bunch of people from AMO, the distributors, various vendors and so on, and people are going, yep, no one's done this, it's going to be hard. And these are the people that are actually doing it, you know. Highly likely the grid will become less reliable. And at times, it's going to struggle to supply electricity. Now, that will improve with time, but I think particularly to start off with, we're going to see that. We've already got very expensive retail energy in Australia. It was very cheap. Since privatisation in particular, it's become a lot more expensive. But there's some tailwinds as well. Price of solar, it's just dropped through the floor. When I visited my first on-grid system, which is I think the second in Victoria, that was that nice fella over in Brunswick West. They used to have open days so people could come and look at their solar panels. You know, this is back in the sort of early mid-90s. But the price of solar has just dropped through the floor. If you haven't got solar now, you're losing money. As simple as that. It's not an environmental issue anymore, it's a financial issue. Battery prices are dropping. That's another really interesting development. EV prices are dropping. And one of the great things about having such crap housing in Australia is that it's really easy to make big improvements and save a lot of energy. The sort of stuff I'm involved in heavily, on-site energy management and so on, that's becoming more readily available. Who's got a PV diverter here? Who's already diverting energy from their PV system to their hot water system or something like that? Oh, I've got a few. Yeah, that's going to become a lot more common. The innovative electricity tariffs. There's a retailer already who is offering a tariff where energy is free. Free, doesn't cost anything from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. And we're also, thankfully, seeing increasing government support for both energy efficiency, but also putting panels on roofs on low-income households. We don't want to leave people behind in the transition. So other factors are, obviously, I've mentioned electrification, replacing gas already. Virtual power plants and demand response, they're topics of their own. You know, I could spend 15 minutes talking about them. The meeting I was in today was talking partly about dynamic operating envelopes. That's actually limiting supply to your grid and also limiting how much you can export. This sort of external control, distributed energy resources in your home. A lot of people out there would like to get their hands on your kit for one reason or another. Some of them altruistic, some of them not so great. So here's a couple of rowdy ideas. I think the transition should be fast, cost-effective and customer-focused. And I also think that the financial benefits should mainly flow to energy customers. Now, you say that to people in the energy sector and it's like, That's not quite what they've got in mind, you know, and that's what I've been all about for a long time. I'm a householder. I'm looking at, you know, how I might ameliorate these issues over the next 5 years or so. I'm probably going to want to reduce my energy costs. I've never had a client say they want to increase it. I probably want to have a more comfortable house because a lot of houses, as I've mentioned already in Australia, just aren't that great in terms of their thermal comfort. I probably would like to increase my energy resilience so that I can tolerate outages. I can perhaps supply through outages and also spend less money. So economic resilience and reducing emissions. Now, the thing about reducing emissions is the grid is greening so quickly at the moment, that's rapidly going to become a lot less important. Already, the Victorian grid hits 70% renewable energy at times, and people don't realise that. The Victorian grid, we had the dirtiest grid on the planet. There's a couple in Poland I think were a little bit worse. 30 years ago, we had about the dirtiest grid on the planet, and now we're hitting 70% renewable at times. I just think, wow, you know. So how can you actually achieve those goals? Well, solar is a big one. Slap them up on the roof as much as you can fit. I can see a few 10 kilowatt households in the audience, and great to see. Do something about your thermal envelope. Again, it's cheap, it's very effective, it saves money, it makes you more comfortable. And also there's active energy systems. The last two, managing home energy systems and how to sort of put this stuff all in place. Well, Bryce touched on putting in a bigger switchboard. I'll talk a bit more about some stuff along those lines. As I've said, solar, very important. So what I've done here is I've said, all right, well, that's an element. And then I've put across the top some characterisations or some evaluation criteria or something along those lines. And I've given some star ratings. So solar reduces energy costs, 3-star. This three stars the highest, by the way. Increases comfort? Well, not really. But it does mean you can run, say, reverse cycle air conditioners more cheaply. So, sort of a bit. Increased resilience? Yeah. Bryce mentioned supplying load out of an EV. We can also supply load out of some inverters now without needing to be able to island. You can just plug them in and away you go. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions? Well, clearly with the grid as it currently is, and also replacing perhaps gas equipment, definitely. Controller access with an on-site energy management system or a virtual power plant? Yes, solar is very much amenable to that. Insulation, most Australian houses have got crap insulation, and probably not in this room. I suspect quite a few people have already dealt with this. R6, I had to fight the installer that we put R4 in 20 years ago at our house. Nowadays, I just put R6, just default to R6. It just makes a massive difference to the comfort, energy use, and so on. The other one that perhaps doesn't get as much attention as it should is if you're doing renovations, NAThers 8 or 9-star or passive house. Don't mess around. Just build in that resilience. The other one that probably people aren't as familiar with is a cocoon room. Now, what that's all about is when it's really hot, that can kill people. Clear evidence for this. If you have a cocoon room, that's a room that you've set up such that when it's very hot, you will be comfortable. So that can be a mixture of passive elements and active elements. It's well worth considering. Lynn Bynash and Morris from EcoMaster developed the concept about 15 years ago. And I think they did a project with Mildura City Council. And it changed people's lives. There were people that had to spend their day in the bath when it was really hot. All of a sudden, they could come out and spend the day just watching television or talking to their spouse or whatever. Here's a busy slide. I'll just pick out a couple. Battery inverter capable of islanding. That's now very, very durable. So what that means is if the grid's down, you'll still have power, assuming you've got some energy in your battery. That's well worth considering, and it just gives you that ability to supply if the grid's down. The other one that might be a little bit controversial is, as I've mentioned, resistant element hot water systems. That they were demonised 15 years ago when we had one of the dirtiest grids on the planet. But if you're looking at controlling a hot water system, it's much, much easier with an electric element system than it is with a heat pump. Heat pumps are great technology, incredibly efficient and so on. They're a bit pricey, particularly for the high-end ones, the really good quality ones. Electric resistance hot water systems are a lot cheaper, manageable with availability of PV, whereas heat pumps, you shouldn't really be turning a heat pump on or off. So if you can afford it, heat pump, absolutely. There are some reasonable quality heat pumps available that are cheaper than the high-end ones. But, I personally think with these big kilowatts systems that people are putting up, it's something to keep in mind that an electric resistance hot water system may be worth looking at. I've actually got a meeting tomorrow with a manufacturer, and we're looking at a long-lived electric resistance hot water system with replaceable anodes, which is repairable and which will also have open interface for control. And that's a system that might last 50 years. So managing home energy systems. If you've got an in-house display, then you can tell what's working and what isn't. To some extent, that management of the energy system is now devolving onto householders. A guy I helped smart grid in Sydney a while ago, who's actually an energy consultant, I insisted to him that he get an in-house display. He's just detected a potential issue with his reverse cycle air conditioner. He wouldn't have picked that up unless he'd put that display in. Energy management systems, I think we're going to see a lot more of. That's where you've actually got something that's controlling devices, like the EV charger, like the hot water, in line with what's the cheapest tariff, your load profile, and how much PV you're making or your forecast to make. Now, along those lines, you can actually put in a weather station. Might sound like an interesting idea, but what that'll do is tell you the ambient temperature and wind and so on, and then you can see how your house responds to that load and so on. An energy management system can use that with internal temperature monitoring to actually do what's called preheating and pre-cooling, which effectively is using power when it's available to make your house more comfortable. The other one that's worth is a circuit level electricity consumption monitoring. It's really, really useful to be able to tell where you're using power, how much, and so on. To make all this great stuff work, we need enablers. Bryce mentioned 24-pole switchboard, totally. 3-phase wiring. Look, at some houses it probably will be necessary. A client today has just got a quote, $33,000. AusNet say they've got to upgrade the connection back through to quite far upstream. That won't be the case for all houses by any means, but so it's a bit disappointing actually, it was so expensive. open standards. This is already a major issue in Europe, and it will be an issue here. We're not seeing it much at the moment. That's that ability to be able to get away from just the vendor offerings and control devices that access them and so on from other pieces of equipment. And innovative tariffs. And I've already mentioned a solar sponge midday tariff that's very cheap. Where do you get the information to help you with all this? Great question. You know, that's David Strang and I have discussed having pop-up sessions at the Tower Hotel, you know, relaxing over a beer and sort of passing on some information. There's obviously a bunch of ways that possibly people will get help. Neighbours' experiences are really useful, stuff that's worked and hasn't worked and so on. And that's it.
Thank you, David. Amazing. Our third and final speaker is Liz Irvin. Liz is a senior transport planner at Stantec, a design and engineering consulting firm. Liz specialises in sustainable forms of transport and has worked in Melbourne, Canada and the UK. Transport impacts our daily lives, and the right transport mix can help create livable neighbourhoods and strengthen communities. Her favourite project to date was a review of the little streets in the CBD of Melbourne. This involved observing how people used the space and changes to make streets safer and more inviting. Many of these changes are simple, affordable and can be applied anywhere. Tonight, Liz will discuss how we can use a similar approach for safer, more sustainable and enjoyable streets in Boroondara.
It's been great hearing about your home in 2030, and now I will invite us all to maybe step outside our front doors and venture out into the neighbourhood. And I'll be, I guess, discussing a particular reason for stepping outside our homes, and that is to do the school run. So this is, you know, perhaps a scene that's familiar to you if you've happened to drive around as people are doing the school drop-off. This is fairly classic across Melbourne. But I actually have a vision that is a bit different to this for how children get to school in 2030. Before I get there, perhaps we can just look at a bit of the lay of the land. So this is a map looking at how students under 12 currently get to school across Melbourne. So this is the walking rates in various council areas. As you can see, the city centre and the inner suburbs have quite high levels of walking. That darkest green is between 28 and 39% of students walking to school. And then as you get further out, that does drop off. With the exception of Nillumbik, I'm going to investigate this further. It's quite amazing. And likewise with riding a bike to school. So again, quite good performance in the inner suburbs. And then as you go further out, that does drop off. And I think what's noticeable about these two maps is where Boroondara lies, close and bordering to those inner councils, but it does see quite a drop-off in terms of rates of walking and riding to school. Why is this an issue? There are several benefits to students walking and riding to school. Really, unfortunately, we rank so poorly in terms of children's physical activity. It's ranking 140th out of 146 in the world in a recent study. And the vast majority of children actually don't meet the minimum requirements for physical activity. It's also an issue that impacts us all. School traffic accounts for over 20% of morning peak hour traffic. I'm sure you've noticed the difference during school holidays. And as well as that, children who walk or ride to school actually perform better in terms of their concentration. So we invest so much in our children's education, you know, sending them to good schools, getting tutors, helping them with homework. And this is something that could actually give them quite a boost, I think, that they deserve. And also children who walk or ride to school have better spatial awareness. So this comes out of quite an amazing study where they got children to draw their neighbourhoods, and children who were driven everywhere, they could draw the places they go to, but there were very distinct blobs with very little detail of how they were connected. Whereas children who walk or ride could draw these intricate maps showing all the streets in between the places that they go to. And perhaps most importantly, it's what children want. So this is just some stats out of a recent survey that Marybeck did. And when asked how they want to travel to school, 57% of students said that they wanted to ride a bike and 26% said they wanted to walk. and only 6% said they wanted to be driven. I think children really appreciate the independence that this sort of travel gives them. It's a chance to kind of, gear up for the day, maybe with friends, and I think it's a really important part of how they learn to sort of assess risk and that sort of thing. So what can we do about this? Marybeck Council, as I mentioned their survey, this was part of a larger piece of work that they were doing to try and understand some of the barriers that face children walking or riding to school. And these responses are just a survey that they did of parents to try and understand those barriers. So as you can imagine, road safety does come up fairly consistently. Many of the solutions identified were about how to find safe routes to schools or installing new infrastructure such as crossings. And those things definitely should be happening and are in the process of happening, but do take time and money. And Marybeck Council really wanted something that they could focus on right away. And as it turns out, another thing that was quite common is just about traffic at the school gate, which is something that council can do something about. And what started out of this was a program called Open Street. Basically, at the start and end of the school day, the street in front of the school is closed to cars and really opened up for the children to play, which, as you can see, they do with enthusiasm. And this really changed the whole nature of the street. Parents are there kind of relaxing before school. Children are walking and riding and really making the most of that new space for them. The results have been quite amazing. So there was a big boost to walking and riding to school. Car traffic in some cases actually decreased on the neighbouring streets. And really quite amazingly, there was such wide levels of support. So it's not just the students, it's also parents, teachers and local residents support the program and want it to happen more often. I think the quote there from a local resident is just really great to see that people who live near schools are also affected by the congestion and care about student safety as well. When I see results like this, in my line of work, if we had this much support, we would be saying, what can we do next? How can we make this bigger and better? And really the question that I have is, can we do this permanently? Open Streets are an amazing program, but the level of traffic control required to close the street at the start and end of the school day, it is a lot of effort and it's quite difficult to do. So perhaps there's a way we could permanently reduce the traffic in front of the school. And as it turns out, there's one of my favourite things in my work is something called a modal filter. This is something that's installed in the street, basically prevents cars from travelling down it, but still allows people to walk or ride. So you can think of it as filtering what modes of transport are allowed through. So these can range from something as simple as bollards, as you see on the left, nicely graffitied in Fitzroy, through to curb extensions and islands, like the photo in the middle. And then it's even possible to take over an entire block, use the space, convert the whole road to a pocket park. The reason that I like modal filters is, as well as reducing car traffic, they also create new space on the street. And this has so many benefits. So firstly, space for more trees, planting, greenery. This is so important. Our streets are actually the hottest parts of our city. Any efforts that can be made to introduce more shade helps reduce the urban heat island effect. It's also helping biodiversity. You can add water-sensitive urban design to help manage drainage and stormwater runoff. Just converting those pockets to green space is really important. They also provide more space for the schools themselves. So these are two examples in Melbourne. Large sort of sports ground in Essendon Primary School is actually in what was once the road reserve. They've expanded into the road and closed that off to through traffic. And likewise with Albert Park Primary, as they expanded their school population, they realised they couldn't fit in their footprint anymore. They've actually taken over the block that's sort of in between those two side streets. And that's used during the day as an extension of the school grounds, and then evenings and weekends it's for the community. But maybe my favourite benefit is that ideally when you introduce one modal filter, it does actually extend out. So the photo on the left is of a modal filter on Canning Street. This is in front of Carlton North Primary School. And this is actually a series of modal filters that makes Canning Street a really quiet, safe street to walk or ride on. It actually changes the whole nature of the street, so much so that if you ask any cyclist who rides in the inner north what their favourite street is, they're likely to say Canning Street. The Age article on the right is actually the results of a large survey of cyclists who reported where they feel safest and least safe riding, featuring yours truly. Me on Canning Street, that's my commute every morning. It is really amazing. I think as you see people use the space differently, they really can reimagine what our streets are for. And the Canning Street median is just a really great example of that. It's used just as an amazing public asset. So residents on the street treat it almost as an extension of their front gardens. It's, used to socialise, to gather, got sort of impromptu flea markets popping up. It's really quite incredible to see. And this just wouldn't be possible without it being a really low traffic, safe and comfortable environment. So how can this be done in Boroondara? I personally would love to see Canning Street rolled out across Melbourne. Any council actually has the power to install a modal filter. It can be done as a genuine traffic diversion experiment, which is Local Government Act speak for a trial. And so this does require engagement with the community. It can be an idea that comes from the community as well. That also is a really great way to make this happen. And the idea is that you're, putting it in and then monitoring how it's performing over time. And you can start off very simply. It can just be a matter of putting in bollards, sort of bolt down curbs, anything that just stops cars' movements and allows people to experience the space. If the objectives are met and you have community support, then you can work with people to actually develop a permanent modal filter. This is in Yarraville, where you can see on the left that initially, the street had just been closed to cars using planters and bollards. It's very simple, but not great looking. Over the last year or so, they've actually worked with the school and the wider community to develop this park, and it's a really incredible space. If you're ever that side of town, I highly recommend going. It's got a variety of different seating for people to sort of gather and socialise. It's got trees that will really grow up to provide amazing shade. It's got, a really nice stream and water-sensitive urban design to manage drainage. And I can imagine that, at the start and end of every school day, this is a really buzzing, amazing place. And the aerial view of this just shows what actually happens when you take over that space and that asphalt and turn it into something amazing for the community. So when talking about modal filters, I don't want you to think that it's just about the school run. I think that it's about so much more. And these are really a catalyst for greater change in our communities. I think firstly, when you're looking at school and that sort of behaviour, you've now got more children walking, riding to school. You also have them experiencing public space differently. And this is such an incredible opportunity to normalise walking and riding for a whole new generation. In addition, if you have this sort of network and that ripple effect of more modal filters, you're creating traffic-calmed streets and a network, which is getting more residents walking and riding as well. I think those two factors combined are leading to more community support for sustainable transport initiatives. So you're looking at things like car share, more bike parking, accessible public transport. It can really have a big impact in other areas as well. And then there's the sort of physical nature of the modal filters themselves. You've got the space for trees, planting, water-sensitive urban design. And this is, of course, providing shade, tackling the urban heat island effect and reducing stormwater runoff. And all of this is really combining to lead to a more sustainable built environment and really hopefully providing an example for other councils to follow. So I would like to finish just by asking you, what will your school street look like in 2030? And how can we make that actually ripple out and affect the other streets around your neighbourhood? Thank you.
I'll start and then I think David will finish. I'll do the short answer of both, but it'll be a small battery for the house. So you won't put the biggest batteries that you used to put in. David can certainly fit in a lot more, I think, on there.
Well, this is a good one. There's a lot of talk about vehicle to grid, and there has been a lot of talk. The car vendors have got to sign up for it. They've got to warranty it. You've got to have a situation where it's convenient for you to connect the battery from the car to your house. What hours are you going to need a battery? How's that going to fit in with your use of the car? How is the charging going to work? Assuming V2G does arrive in the way that people are perhaps expecting it to at the moment, it probably makes more sense to have a car with a battery with V2G. Other places, I think it makes more sense to have a stationary battery. The other thing is the cost of the charger. Like I think that the Leaf charger is $10,000, I think, from memory. It's very expensive. Now that will come down. I don't think there's any argument there. But you're probably still looking at, I don't know, 3 to 4 maybe. What do you think? Yeah. So it's quite a bit of money to pay for the actual charger to give you V2G capability. So I think it's horses for courses. I wouldn't want to give a flat answer to that either way. But I have a battery sitting in my house ready to be connected. And, so I've voted that way, I suppose, if you like. So, and all my clients, they say, these days I just say get a battery. And I also say get a battery with an inverter that's capable of supporting islanding. Where V2G sits with supporting islanding, I'll hand that one over to Bryce, I think.
The vehicle-to-home stuff is islanding a bit large, so it just turns off the grid and turns on. The reason I said a small battery is most around town you'll be basically losing power for maybe an hour or 2 or 3, so you want a battery that might provide half a day or a day's power, which is much smaller than the big batteries that are going in at the moment. So if you want longer than that, sort of more than half a day or perhaps, that's where your vehicle-to-grid car comes in. So out of suburban areas, they will be putting into vehicle-to-grid systems. There's actually a little bit of a war going on between what the vehicle-to-grid systems will do. So if you're really desperate for one, they'll be available starting roughly next year. But Renault have just announced the vehicle-to-grid system using the AC charger in the car. So the box on the wall will be considerably cheaper. It might be $1,000 to $2,000 sort of dollars. So there will be something coming along to there as well. So it might be a lot cheaper to put it in. So my advice is you don't need a super big battery in the house to soak up so much power to provide a week's power. It will be just smaller, and you can use the car battery as the backup system.
Yeah, it's a great question. It is, a lot of my work is essentially doing that. It can be quite frustrating to have that level of opposition. I do know that it does tend to be a fairly vocal minority, if that's of any comfort. I think when we actually survey a wider proportion of the community, and when we hear from people who aren't normally engaged with, we actually do hear a high level of support. And so I think that really with using this approach, it's perhaps important to work with the community, definitely. I think that a lot of schools, and that's why schools are such a good place to start as well, schools will recognise that there's an issue with traffic in front of their gates. And they'll often be working for solutions to try and get things to happen. I don't know if anyone saw sort of City of Stonington made the news recently with some changes they've made. I think that having the community that's on board with making things safer for students arriving is a really good point to start. Residents are probably already frustrated by congestion as well, and this is actually a solution to a lot of different problems. So I think it is about working with people, from very early stages. The great thing about having the open streets sort of trial is that people can experience it for themselves and see the benefits and actually, work out a different route on the days that it's on and that sort of thing. So I think just having those sort of experiential type interventions let people see that the sky won't fall in, we can adjust, move on, and they see the benefits as well. Yeah, so just around people who walk or ride spending more at shops and how that benefits traders. Yeah, this is something that is actually sort of replicated worldwide. It's surprisingly consistent. And quite often traders' impressions of people who drive is that they spend more money, and that may be the case in kind of a one-off purchase. But what they found when doing extended studies is that people who walk or ride might spend less each time, but they're at the shops multiple times every week. So over the course of a week or a month, they do spend more locally. And yeah, certainly what's been happening in London and Paris is, I think, really incredible. Again, both cities are actually also doing a lot with school streets and with converting that space as well. I mean, if you look up Paris's school streets, they're like obviously next level because it's Paris, but they've just created these incredible gardens in front of streets. They're not even, they're definitely not messing around. It's incredible. But yeah, I think that when traders do eventually see the benefits of it, they do actually become really supportive. I know in Vancouver, the sort of Traders Association there is now saying, please put in more bike lanes. They're so good for us. So, there is sort of a shifting of the tide as things do change.
I have been kind of banking on the idea that in a couple of years we'll get an EV and that will be our home battery. And I know this question has kind of been asked before, but I still don't get it. Bryce, why are you saying I'm going to have to reset my clocks?
Briefly, if it's vehicle to home, it turns off the grid for a moment, so the power is not ever coming out of the car to the grid. So it breaks before makes, so to speak. So it breaks the connection to the grid and then makes the connection to the car. So you don't have to match the waveform of the AC cycle to what's out in the grid. We'd marry up the waveform so it would go up and down at the same time as from the car and the grid together. Generators do the same thing. They have to actually match the grid before they can connect. Otherwise, they put huge voltages and spikes and can blow things up.
That doesn't seem very practical for the average homeowner to have to be resetting all of their appliances.
Vehicle to home is basically a backup system. So it's not something that you'll be doing constantly. It is something that you're living in the outer suburbs, the power goes down for a couple of weeks because there's been a big storm. Vehicle to home will work beautifully.
You know, this stuff is not simple. You know, there are gotchas all over the place. There's a lot of situational stuff. We're working our way through this.
The other side of the coin is it's constantly changing. As I said, Renault have just announced a system that will do it through the inverter in the car. So you don't have a inverter or a box on a wall. It'll be much cheaper to do. Whether that takes off or not, we wait to see. Yeah, the car can be vehicle to grid or vehicle to home. It's the supply authorities allowing that grid connection to happen that's a little bit into the future, whereas home will be very soon. Will a car battery actually power a whole house? If it's a vehicle to load system where you just plug in the adapter and you're just getting a 3-pin extension lead out of it, that's 15 amps. That won't power a whole house if everything turned on. Vehicle to home or grid system, if it's out of the DC side, they can do quite large currents, and they probably will power a whole house on their own. As I was saying, people may want the vehicle to home or grid system because it gives them a lot more power. It's just there is that slight difference in the home to grid. To try and explain it to Lynn, is that the supply authorities won't allow yet you to have your car charging or powering power out into the grid yet. They've got to agree the communication standards and all sorts of stuff around that. The same thing, except one matches the power to what the grid's providing, so it can go back and forth, whereas the other one just says, we'll just shut the grid off for a moment, turn on the car, but it's the same box, it's just a bit more software. They've got to have the right power connections from the box to the switchboard to give the same amount of power. And there'll be circuit breakers and control systems. That's what the expensive box on the wall would be. That's what the $10,000 box for Chatamo system was. It will get much greater numbers because all cars are the CCS system now. So you might get down to $4,000 or $5,000 for that box, but it's not going to get much cheaper than that. The question was, what's the difference between vehicle to home and grid? The box on the wall is the same. It's just where they're putting power just to the house or out into the grid, and that's where that communication standards come in, where they go, oh, we're a bit low, there's not enough wind or enough, a coal-fired power station fell down, can we borrow some power from your car for a while and we'll let you recharge a bit more later, and I give you a really good tariff to do it. So it's the grid stuff is what the supply authorities want, the home stuff is what the homeowner wants.
I'll just add a bit to that, but the virtual power plant people really want to get their hands on your battery because they can sell the power from that into times when the National Energy Market spot price is very high. That goes up to $18,000 a megawatt hour at times. So it's actually quite profitable to sell in at that point. So if they've got access to your battery, then they can sell into that at that time and then share some money back to you. And that's where the kind of sticking point at the moment is, that you've got the returns coming back to most of our virtual power plants that I'm aware of, the returns coming back to the actual energy customers, probably could be better. And so there's been a really poor uptake so far. What you've just raised is the vehicle to grid. That's the one that's getting a whole lot of people excited because they can clip the ticket on the way through and make some money out of it. It's also useful for things like what's called FCAS, or frequency control ancillary services. That's when you need to do something about, and Bryce has mentioned this a couple of times already, that's when you need to do something about the grid frequency or even potentially local system strength, et cetera, et cetera. You can actually use batteries to help with that. You can do the same thing by managing demand, by turning off hot water systems. Again, this is why people want to be able to have access to your equipment. The demand response is in the space where people want to turn air conditioners on and off. The thing about demand response, always a bit crazy, my idea is that they want to turn off the air conditioners at times of really high grid demand. Well, it's high grid demand because it's hot, and that's when you want your air conditioner running. You don't want to be turning it off. And demand response hasn't had a great deal of success in Australia, for that being one of the reasons. There's a lot of interest in you buying equipment so other people can make money out of it.
I think so. I'll briefly disagree with the 40 solar panels. I did calculations years ago. You need, depending on the amount of power you use in your house, 4 to 8 sort of kilowatt hours of panels. So whatever number of panels that works out as they're getting bigger and more powerful these days, it ain't 40. As far as using your car as a battery, the grid is your battery. So around town, you don't need the car as your permanent backup and using it, recharging in the day and putting power out at the night. Sometimes you might want to use it to save some money, but it's generally speaking, you're not going to use it a lot anyway. And I agree with David on that point. It's probably overhyped, the vehicle to grid stuff, versus what people will do around town. I'll hand this rest to David.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got the standard size at the moment, it's about 450 watts. So if you had 40 panels, you'd have 18 kilowatts, which is a big-ass system. I mean, that's a lot of kilowatts on your roof. Older panels, of course, were smaller, so 40 panels would have been, quite a bit less than that. So you might be talking about like 250 watts, which would have been, say, 10 kilowatts. An 18 kilowatt system would be enormous. A 10 kilowatt system, I think 10 kilowatts isn't a bad size, frankly. With the price these days, with a battery and with an EV, and with an electric house, and I reckon 10 kilowatts isn't a bad size to be. If you've got the roof space, some of it will be north facing, which is obviously best, but then some of it's probably going to be a bit east and west, and you might have the shading, and so on and so forth. So 10 kilowatts isn't a bad size to be aiming at, in my opinion.
Battery fires are extraordinarily rare, and the standards are designed to prevent spread of fires. That they have various standards. You can't build your own battery system anymore as part of that. So the battery systems are certainly a lot safer. There is a recall on one system at the moment that can cause a fire, but the standards are the way it's installed, basically shouldn't spread. Yes, the old standard, the system for putting in solar panels, you can't move the old system because you have to upgrade it to the new standards. But as standard with any electric wiring, if you're changing some circuits now, you have to change the circuit breakers from a type AC to a type A because that's the standard required now. That is normal for all electrical installations. The standards upgrade. If you're working on the systems, be it a circuit or be it a solar panel system or be it a battery system, you have to upgrade them to the current standard. If you're just doing a few minor repairs and things, they're fine. That was legal at the time, they stay legal. So you can have an old switchboard with fuses. If you've never touched the house, it is still legal. May not be all that safe anymore because it's got old rubber wiring and things, but it's still, that was the standard in the day. It's only when you make changes that the new standards start to apply. So I'm in the same boat. I have a 1.2 kilowatt hour system. I can't change that. I lose my, I'll have to upgrade it to the current standard. But also I lose my feed-in tariff, the premium feed-in tariff this November. So I'm thinking about what to replace it with now. So I haven't paid an electricity bill in 15 and a half years, and I've got a 1.2 kilowatt hour system. So back to your 40 panels, I've got 8 175 watt panels that have kept that house going and charging the cars that I've had over the last 10, 12 years now.
It's extraordinary.
All right,
I'm an electrician and do all of that number crunching, and I just have kept the standing wattage on the house is 20 watts.
Yeah, so the question is around how parents want their kids to get to school, as well as asking the children, and about what e-bikes can do to help parents too. I'm pretty sure it was in the same data that, parents do want their children to travel to school independently. I don't have kids myself, but I have friends who do. I don't know any of them who enjoy the school run unless they are actually riding with their kids to school. Everyone sort of supports the idea in principle. It is just about overcoming some of those barriers. And certainly there were other barriers. Sometimes it is like distance to school or other factors. Quite often it's kind of on the way for parents, so it is an easier trip. Parents do support their children walking or riding as well. As for e-bikes, Marybeck's program also included e-bike subsidies for parents. So they use the lug and carry sort of subscription thing. You sort of pay a weekly fee instead of having to buy it outright. And so Marybeck Council actually subsidised that for parents as part of a trial, and just had a really great uptake of the bikes. So, you actually see them everywhere now. It's really amazing. But certainly the feedback from that was that it made a great difference to being able to take kids to school by bike.
Thanks, everyone. So a big round of applause for Bryce and David.